Hi, and welcome back to the Unseen podcast, a podcast dedicated to missing people, unresolved cases, and UK true crime. Today we're going to be exploring the mysterious and tragic murder of mum of two, Jacqueline Palmer Radford, at her home in Eversley in Hampshire in 1992. There were some very odd elements to Jacqueline's murder that add mystery to it and cause people to wonder why such an unlikely victim was targeted. This episode contains descriptions that some listeners may find distressing, so listener discretion is advised. The village of Eversley is a small village located around 11 miles away from the larger town of Basingstoke. It is a generally rural village with a small population. The residents were friendly with each other, and it was a place where new or different things were noticed purely due to the village's size. Eversley is where Jacqueline Palmer Radford lived with her two sons in 1992. Jacqueline had separated from her husband around 18 months prior. The couple had been together for 18 years, and so this split caused some huge changes in her life. Jacqueline lived at a home called Riversdale House in the village with her children, her eldest son who was 16 and her youngest who was 6. Jacqueline had been building up a new life for herself as a newly single woman of 40, and by all accounts was becoming interested in many new hobbies and widening her social circle. She had started an open university course and had taken up a number of sports which she was enjoying. Through these new activities, Jacqueline was meeting new people and slowly getting over such a huge upheaval in her and her children's lives. Everything seemed to be working out great for her, and she seemed to be enjoying her life and getting on with looking after her children. Jacqueline cared deeply about her two sons and was very involved in their lives. For this reason, Wednesday the 1st of April 1992 stuck out in the minds of the staff at Jacqueline's youngest son's primary school which he attended. Nobody had come to pick him up from school that day, and he was still waiting for his mum at 4 o'clock. This was certainly unusual and struck everyone that knew Jacqueline in any capacity as strange. She was always there for her sons and would have let someone know if she was running late or something had happened. This event would sadly foreshadow the events of that awful afternoon. Jacqueline's eldest son returned home to Riversdale House at around 5:30 that evening after being at college. His statement to the inquest was later reported by the Reading Evening Post, and he explained that when he got home he found he was locked out. He found his spare key and eventually entered the home. A horrendous sight greeted him as he found his mother dead in the kitchen. Her death was clearly not an accident, as her son would later say as reported by the Reading Evening Post. I saw my mother lying on her back in the kitchen. She was naked from the waist down. Her face had turned blue, and it was obvious that she was dead. I called 999, and at some point I started pushing her chest. There appeared to be sick in her mouth. The headmistress from Jacqueline's younger son's school had travelled back home with him at this point to see what had happened, and was walking down the street when his brother came running out of the house. She later said that he ran out and threw his arms around her and begged her to help him. This is just a heartbreaking image, and I can't imagine how hard this must have been for Jacqueline's children. This awful scene soon became a crime scene, with police swarming to try and figure out what had happened to this mother of two. Police began to analyse the information that they had. Jacqueline had been found in the kitchen in her home, and when Jacqueline's body was assessed by a Home Office pathologist, Dr. Peter Long, it was found that she had been asphyxiated and had also been subjected to a sexual assault. The scene was a little strange in the way that there didn't appear to have been a break-in, and there also didn't seem to be anything missing, to suggest that robbery had been the motive. Police were quite baffled by the scene and by the motive of the perpetrator. While there was a sexual assault, the theory began to grow from early on that this was perhaps someone Jacqueline knew or someone who she was at least acquainted with. This was due to the fact that there was no break-in and there didn't appear to have been a struggle prior to Jacqueline's death. The fact that she had also been suffocated and hadn't been killed in a more violent manner suggested to police that this may be someone known to her and not a stranger attack. Detective Constable Mike Scott from Hampshire Police told the Reading Evening Post 2 weeks after her death, "If she had suffered a violent death, we would think that we were looking for a stranger. But on this occasion we have someone who doesn't appear to have struggled to get onto the premises, and she was then suffocated. Who did this and why is a complete mystery." The fact that police believed that Jacqueline perhaps knew her killer led them, perhaps inevitably, to Jacqueline's ex-husband Werner. The couple had separated, and it's common knowledge that most victims are murdered by someone that they know, particularly women. Therefore, it's unsurprising that he was spoken to very soon after Jacqueline's murder. Newspapers reported at the time that he was interviewed that he was released without any charge, implying that there wasn't anything of interest discovered or found at that time that could prove anything. Police were very interested in trying to find out as much as they could about Jacqueline's private life and about her usual movements or anything out of the ordinary about them in the days leading up to her death. Less than 2 weeks after her murder, Thames Valley Police issued a poster with 2 recent photographs of Jacqueline on, in the hope that seeing her picture would jog someone's memory. Detective Constable Mike Scott continued to speak to the media about the investigation and told the Reading Evening Post, "We have been interviewing friends and relatives all week. At the moment we're trying to find out as much as we can about the deceased and her relationships with family and friends. We are still working flat out to try and find out all we can about it from people that knew her." This became a main line of inquiry, and officers were trying to track down anything they could that could provide that crucial piece of information. Officers spoke with Jacqueline's family and friends, and also with her neighbours in the area, who it was hoped would possibly have seen something. When speaking to residents, police discovered that they were all shocked and horrified by what had happened to Jacqueline, and they were surprised that it could happen in their friendly village. They also didn't have much to add about Jacqueline or the family, as neighbours reported to the Reading Evening Post that they didn't really know them very well, despite the family living there for 8 years. Several neighbours of the family stated that it seemed as though they didn't want to get to know anyone in the community and acted quite secretively. One stated, "They didn't want to know anyone. They thought of their house as their castle. They were a very secretive family." Another said, "We are a very friendly village, but for some reason this family didn't want to make friends with anyone. You can't make friends with people who don't want to be friends. After many attempts, we left them alone." It's hard to judge these comments, given that the family appear to have been set against the expectations of others in the village, and it's natural that some people may want more privacy than others. Whether Jacqueline wanted to be left alone or not, the information is interesting, as it's clear that the neighbours knew little about them, and therefore would not have been privy to their usual routine. Despite the fact that few people actually knew Jacqueline or the family that well in the village due to the close-knit nature and the size of the village, residents did notice anything out of the ordinary or unusual. This was very important for the police, who could at least narrow down some aspects of it, not just Jacqueline's movements, but other people in Eversley. This timeline was later broken down on a Crime Watch segment about the murder on national TV. Police were able to establish that on Tuesday the 31st of March 1992, the day before the murder, Jacqueline had had a relatively normal day. She had dropped her youngest son off at school in Crowthorne, around 4 miles away from the village. One of the other parents, however, had noticed something unusual that day outside of the school. They noticed a brown Vauxhall Chevette hatchback parked across the road, which appeared to be lingering. The witness said that the man in the driver's seat didn't appear to be looking at the school or anything in particular. However, he did look quite tense and serious, and this struck the witness. The next morning, residents in the village itself had spotted something else that seemed off. At around 8:30 on the morning that Jacqueline was murdered, a beige Peugeot 205 car was spotted a few hundred yards away from Jacqueline's home at a small office block. The beige car pulled into the car park and a woman was driving it. She wasn't an employee at the office, and so her car and her presence stood out to the staff. She was also wearing a green scarf on her head as though she were hiding herself. The woman was very pale with red or ginger short hair. The witness got the impression that she was very thin, although she didn't see the rest of her body. The presence of a stranger in the village was odd, particularly as she stayed in the car and didn't seem to have any business there. The car stayed in the car park until at least later that morning, when employees saw it outside. The woman had took her headscarf off at that point, which is when they could clearly see her hair. She left in the mid-morning. Again, this was not directly linked to Jacqueline, however it stood out as important to the residents, as it was close to Riversdale House. It was thought it could be important. Something that was directly linked to Jacqueline, or at least her home, were two other sightings. In the time that Jacqueline had left the home and was on her way to take her son to school, a witness was driving past Riversdale House when a car in front began to indicate to turn into a driveway. It was around 9:10 a.m, and the witness remembered as he had to stop and wait behind it for it to turn in. He noted that the car was turning into Jacqueline's driveway and spotted the sign for Riversdale House. The significance of this, of course, is that it's now known that Jacqueline may not have been at home at this time, and so who was this person and why were they parking on her driveway? There was something else significant about this sighting. The witness described the car as brown and gave a very similar description to that of the car seen outside Jacqueline's son's school the previous day. Whether these were the same car, however, hasn't been established. It is known that Jacqueline must have returned pretty much straight away after this, as she was home by 9:15 a.m. We know as she spoke to her mum on the phone, and it was reported that she was her usual self. Strangely that day, a man was also seen on the property at around midday. This man was described as smartly dressed and stood on the driveway to the house looking up at it. Police would later say that this man could have been an estate agent or a surveyor, as while Riversdale House was not on the market yet, Jacqueline was considering selling it and had had meetings with estate agents to put it on the market soon. It was likely that this man was probably connected to selling the home. However, it is important that he too was ruled out as having anything to do with Jacqueline's death. As we have already discussed, Jacqueline failed to pick up her son when he finished school that day, so it's likely that she'd already been murdered by that point. All of these things combined to create a picture, however didn't actually explain what Jacqueline did with the rest of her day, who she saw, or where she went. It was possible that none of these sightings had anything to do with her murder at all. However, police needed more information to establish this. In June 1992, 2 months after her murder, the case was featured on BBC's Crime Watch, and it was hoped by presenting all of this information, something could be discovered. Other information was also presented on the programme. A photo fit of the man that was seen in the brown car outside Jacqueline's son's school was shown. The man was believed to be in his 40s with sandy hair, which was scruffy on the top, and he had a pale complexion. So pale that he looked ill. He was wearing a white shirt and a grey pullover. Two other pieces of evidence were described and shown. A pen had been recovered from Jacqueline's driveway. It was a common design with a zigzag pattern along the side and retailed for around £30 to £32, or around £65 today. On the episode, the police speculated that it could have been dropped by the smartly dressed man seen on the driveway. Another piece of evidence was found in the house. An Open University prospectus was found with the name Lawrence Gillam written on it, along with the time of 10:40. Police were eager to find out who Lawrence Gillam was, or whether this was an appointment for that day or another day. There was also a sighting of a man that witnesses thought was suspicious. At around 11 a.m, a man was seen running not far from Jacqueline's home. He stood out because he was running wearing jogging bottoms, trainers, and a long plastic raincoat. He was carrying a Sainsbury's carrier bag, along with a bag that looked like an airline bag. He clearly stood out to witnesses, and police wanted to trace him. It was clear that some or none of these things could be relevant to the investigation, but it was crucial that they were ruled out of the investigation. The programme brought in over 100 tips, and police began to sift through them all. It was useful, as they were able to rule out at least two pieces of evidence they recovered. It was reported by the Reading Evening Post that the pen was claimed by a friend of Jacqueline's, and Lawrence Gillam came forward and explained the note on the prospectus. He was eliminated from the inquiry. DC Mike Scott said this was useful as it cleared up a number of niggling points, but that they still hadn't solved the murder. One thing that they weren't able to clear up was the identity of the man in the brown car, and this was something they were eager to find out. The investigation continued on through July 1992, with a squad of 20 detectives running down all the leads that came in. Unfortunately, as happens sometimes with murder inquiries, the leads began to dry up, and less information came into police. This did begin to happen in Jacqueline's case, and as a result, the squad working on it was slimmed down to just 12 detectives by January 1993. A year after Jacqueline's murder in April 1993, police reported that they thought they knew who had killed her and were presenting a file to the Crown Prosecution Service. A police spokesperson told the Reading Evening Post, "We expect we'll be sending the papers to the CPS towards the end of the month. After it has been reviewed, the CPS will decide if we have enough evidence to arrest our suspect." It's unclear who this suspect was, however, or why they decided that they may have murdered Jacqueline, as a year later in April 1994, it was reported in the papers once again that they were close to submitting a file to the CPS so that they could arrest one suspect for the murder. Police stated that they believed that they have been following the right line of inquiry from the beginning and that they believed they had the correct suspect. They said, "There are no other issues which we feel would point us in a different direction to the one we have been following from the start." It would appear that this filing with the CPS went no further. It was confirmed that by 1994, just 3 officers were working on Jacqueline's case. Since then, there has been little published about her case, and it still remains unsolved to this day, which is extremely sad. There is so little that is known about Jacqueline, her life, or what she did that morning. It's believed that she was murdered at some point on the morning of the 1st of April, and police have stated that they believe it was someone she knew, as there was no struggle and no robbery. We do have to remember, though, that Jacqueline was sexually assaulted, and so this could definitely have been the primary motive. Was it someone she knew, that friends and family and neighbours possibly didn't know about or hadn't seen? Had she recently met someone, who then killed her? Had someone turned up at the house and Jacqueline had felt comfortable enough to let them in? And why had Jacqueline been targeted? She was very private about her life, and therefore she may have had things she did not share with others. and getting to the bottom of it may prove tricky. Were any of the people sighted that day involved? Certainly, the man in the brown-style Chevette car is still a crucial person of interest, and despite multiple appeals at the time, he never came forward. Why did he pull into Jacqueline's driveway that day? The police did at one point believe they had a main suspect. Who was this, and why did they not proceed with charges? There is so much we don't know about Jacqueline's murder, but I cannot get the images of her son discovering her body and her other son waiting for his mum to pick him up from school. They did not deserve to grow up without their mother, and the person responsible should have been brought to justice. Her family, and particularly her children, should have the answers they need, and I really do hope we see some more progress in this case. If you know anything about the murder of Jacqueline Palmer Radford in 1992, please contact police on 101 with what you know. Anything could help. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you'd like to support the podcast further, then you can on Patreon and contribute to exclusive polls to get extra bonus episodes every month. You can also get access to new episodes early and ad-free. You can use the link in the show notes to visit Patreon and see what we offer. You can also support us by reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, including Spotify, and also just share the episodes. You can subscribe on YouTube and follow us on social media. You can also now subscribe and listen to my other podcast, 10-Minute True Crime, which tells infamous crimes in a short-form, bite-sized 10 minutes for people on the go or who just like the facts. Find that wherever you listen and in the show notes. As always, I'm Caprice, and this has been Unseen.